When Walter Cronkite was in Vietnam, unfortunately for President Johnson, he was there during the Tet Offensive. He witnessed that. He came back and was very concerned on what was going on. And then he got on national television at the end of one of his broadcasts and basically made the comment that the best we could do in Vietnam was a stalemate or a tie, and the only way out was to negotiate. And Johnson made the comment that if he had lost Walter Cronkite, then he had lost all. He had lost Mr. Average Citizen. 2 days after Cronkite made that announcement on CBS News, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara resigned, and Clark Clifford was named as his replacement. Now, the point I'm going to make now is the Tet Offensive is going to cause more and more and more resentment back in the United States. And it was after the Tet Offensive when opposition to the war was at its highest peak. More people were upset about the Vietnam War after the Tet Offensive than ever. And I'm going to give you 4 notable protests that went on after the Tet Offensive in the United States, showing people did not appreciate our continued involvement in what a war they believe now was unwinnable. And as I mentioned, every night on TV, body counts, how many were killed and wounded in Vietnam. People became getting more and more upset. They no longer believed that we were winning the war, and protests came out. The first one happened on October 21st of 1967. And this one actually happened prior to the Tet Offensive. And was one of the reasons why Johnson brought William Westmoreland back to try to convince people that we were winning. So this one actually happened before the Tet Offensive. And because of the events at this particular protest, Lyndon Johnson felt that he needed to bring Westmoreland back to talk to the American people. And it happened in Washington, D.C. It happened in Washington, D.C. Crowd of over 100,000 protesters tried to close the Pentagon. A crowd of over 100,000 protesters tried to close the Pentagon. Well, what did the Pentagon do to hold off that action? They put soldiers, they lined soldiers up outside the Pentagon, around the Pentagon, to try to curb these 100,000 protesters from trying to close it. So they simply put armed military police all the way around the Pentagon to keep this crowd back so they would not breach the security of the Pentagon. Well, pushing came to shoving, and pushing came to shoving, and it could have been a pretty doggone violent and maybe deadly situation, because it was starting to get a little Western. And finally, some more conservative protesters had everybody link arms, and they started chanting, "We're not against the soldiers, we're against the war. We're not against the soldiers, we're against the war," as they stared into the eyes of these armed military police, who would have certainly taken action if it would have gotten much more out of control. And the chant began by more sensible protesters: "We're not against the soldiers, we're against the war. We're not against the soldiers, we're against the war." They continued to chant this to try to ease the tension between the soldiers that were guarding the Pentagon and those protesters that you had more conservative and more violent approaches. You get 100,000 people together and they all have different viewpoints, right? And anybody can do anything to start something that's a nightmare. One of these peaceful protesters that was chanting, "We're not against the soldiers, we're against the war," to try to curb that tense moment, actually placed a carnation in the barrel of one of the soldiers' guns as a sign of peace as they continued their chant. And you can see the young man in the picture who has taken a carnation and placed it in the barrel of one of the MP's guns as they chanted, "We're not against the soldiers, we're against the war." Now the significance of this is one wrong move on the part of either party could have resulted in gunfire and the death and a nightmare, PR-wise, for the president. And when he knew this was happening, when he saw this protest, and 100,000 people is a lot of people, okay? Could have really been a bad situation. This is when Johnson said, you know, we've got to assure the American people, you know, that things are going well in Vietnam, and that's what he did. Unfortunately, we know how that turned out. Okay, so now we're going to talk about other protests that happened after the Tet Offensive in America. Yep.
What was the person saying that?
Well, we're gonna leave that because I got something coming later. Okay, I'll let you decide that. Okay. All right. No, it's not a signature.
Oh, sorry.
No, but there's a really neat comparison coming. Okay, later. I think we'll probably not get to it until after we get back from DC. But I have a documentary video series to show you. It's called the 1960s. Once we get through all this, that kind of is a fictional story about all the things we talked about. Very good.
We're lecturing to Reagan or Bush?
Well, I'm not sure yet.
Oh.
Anyway, the second one happened on April 25th of 1968. This was kind of interesting. And I think that the young bar girl that was in school, who's at Columbia University, and the young Keynes girl who's at school at Columbia, have seen remnants of this one because it happened on April 25th. Chantal and Paris, who were at Columbia University, the site of this protest on April 25th, 1968. So Columbia University in New York City, April 25th, 1968. Now, it was kind of interesting here because Columbia University was planning on building a student gymnasium on a playground in which was in a black neighborhood that was being used by local black youth. They owned the property, but it had been basically a playground for black youth that lived in the area. And they were going to bulldoze down that playground and put in a gymnasium. And these young protesters didn't particularly like that. And it was just basically a protest to protest. I'm sure it tied in with the war, and the war had some thought process in this. But again, it was the treatment of blacks, and these students basically took the following actions at the university. A large mob. And they were students from Columbia, for the most part. First of all, they stormed and took over the office of President Grayson Kirk. They stormed Columbia University and forcefully took over President Grayson Kirk's office. They also seized and secured 5 other buildings at the university. They also seized and secured 5 other buildings on the university. Did they do it with weapons? No, they just did it by mass number. Okay? So they stormed and took over the office of President Grayson Kirk. They seized and secured 5 other buildings at the university. And they even held 3 college officials hostage for 24 hours. This is really kind of ugly. Okay? So they seized and took over the office of President Grayson Kirk. They seized and secured 5 other buildings at the university, and they actually held 3 college officials hostage for 24 hours. And Columbia was forced to suspend classes, and they had to bring in local police to restore order on campus, and they weren't real kind in doing so. They were not above beating the heck out of those protesting students. It was a little bit ugly. And you'll get an example of that in the movie we show on the 1960s as well. Okay? So there was the second little incident. The third one occurred in Washington, D.C., outside federal buildings and the White House. Okay, the third one happened in Washington, D.C. This was protest by young adults and they protested at universities in the DC area, outside federal buildings, and even outside the White House. So protests against the Vietnam War in Washington, DC by young adults. They protested at local universities. They protested outside federal buildings in DC and even outside the White House. When they were outside the White House, there were two particular chants directed at President Johnson as they protested. The first one, as they chanted in essence, "Hell no, we won't go. Hell no, we won't go." Hell no, we won't go where?
Vietnam.
We will not serve in Vietnam. He refused to and paid quite a price for it. Never went to jail, but lost a lot of millions of dollars in his profession, which we'll get to when we get to sports in the 60s. Yeah. So they were chanting, "Hell no, we won't go. Hell no, we won't go." But the one that was interesting is this was the chant right outside the White House, and LBJ heard it. "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? In reference to the body counts coming back from Vietnam. So they protested, chanted things like that in front of universities, federal buildings, and especially in front of the White House, especially the last one, hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today? Well, the fourth protest that started after the Tet Offensive wasn't in any particular area. You know what a draft card is? If you guys are too young, I'm going to explain this quickly to you. You guys all are responsible to sign up for the selective service. Males are, once they turn 18, yeah?
They actually just send you the card now.
But they,
There's
okay.
no
Well, you're
sign
good.
up.
Yeah, well, you gotta, if you get a card, that means that you are eligible to go at any time. You used to present that card when you go to report. So what were young men doing with their draft cards in protest? Burning them. They were burning their draft cards, which didn't mean anything. That didn't mean you weren't going to get in. But it was as a protest. The burning of draft cards by young males all over the country was occurring at a pretty rapid rate. And people were going to these drafts, when you get picked and drafted to go in, a lot of them were trying to be conscientious objectors. You could go in and say, I'm a conscientious objector because of my religion. That's what Muhammad Ali did. Or because and I'm just saying at the time, because I'm gay. Guys went in wearing, panties and bras to make people think they were crazy so they wouldn't have to go to Vietnam. They did things like this all the time. And you could be a conscientious objector. When you reported, they were to evaluate you whether you could get it or not, hit or not. And I'm not kidding you. We'll show examples of that in this movie I'm telling you about, where a guy goes in with a bra on and says he's attracted to the recruiter. I mean, anything to try to get out. And then you could be a conscientious objector where you would say, I'm not willing to go because of this. And then you would have a hearing, and they would decide whether you were legit or not legit. And if you were legit, they didn't make you go. And if you were not legit, they would make you go or pay the consequence. Muhammad Ali, they said no. He chose not to go and was stripped of his boxing title and lost millions and millions. He didn't went to the Olympics. That was after. But millions and millions of dollars he lost. And his career probably set back 7 or 8 years. But he never went to jail for it. Okay, and I don't know. We'll talk about when we get to it. Okay. Now, any questions on those protests? Well, all this stuff we've talked about in Vietnam has now led to our next subtopic, which is the fall of LBJ. LBJ knew it was over when Walter Cronkite made the comment he made. So the fall of LBJ. What's coming up in 1968, Kyra? An election, right? And everybody's planning on President Johnson running for re-election. He can do that because he served the remainder of Kennedy's term, was elected to his own in 1964, and so he's eligible for re-election. Now normally, when a sitting president can come up for re-election and makes it clear he's going to want to be re-elected, does he usually face much opposition in the primaries? Not at all. That will not be the case in 1968. So prior to this presidential election of 1968, Johnson's Democratic nomination is going to be in jeopardy because of the Vietnam War. And the guy that boldly decides to challenge President Johnson for the Democratic nomination is this fellow right here, Minnesota Senator Eugene McCarthy. Eugene McCarthy decides, you know what? I'm going to challenge the sitting president for the Democratic nomination in 1968, which was very unusual, but what was he taking advantage of? Johnson's lack of popularity because of the Vietnam War. So Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota decides to challenge President Johnson for the Democratic Party nomination in the upcoming election of 1968. Pretty easy campaign for him. All he had to do is oppose all Johnson's policies in Vietnam, right? He didn't have to know anything. It was a pretty easy campaign for him, okay? Now, what type of Americans that can vote are really going to attract towards McCarthy? Younger. The younger generation are really going to move toward him. That doesn't mean he get support from middle-aged and older people, but older people are conservative and they're for their president, okay? That's, I'm really being nuts here, but I'm so excited to show you this movie, The 60s, because it's a fictional story, but it covers, it's just awesome. It just shows you exactly the older generation's version versus the younger generation. You'll love it, okay? Well, Senator McCarthy has great support from the younger generation of Americans. Now, if you're a younger member of America, you're simply thinking a vote for McCarthy is not only a personal vote against President Johnson, but it's also a vote against the Vietnam War. So, I mean, McCarthy's got kind of an advantage here. But it's still going to be a little bit of a slippery slope. So where's McCarthy going to find out whether he's really going to compete or not? Where's he going to find this out? Well, what do they have prior to the convention? They have all these primary elections that normally start in New Hampshire, remember? Remember that? You have the Democratic Party, you have these primary elections to kind of poll what's going on. The first one's always in New Hampshire. And in New Hampshire, McCarthy almost defeats Johnson in this primary. These little primary elections, these are just to get the party an idea. They have 5 or 6 of them. You know, remember Kennedy's in West Virginia was big. Okay, they have these to kind of poll whether you got a chance here. So you'll have all kinds of people say they're going to run for president 2020, and they'll have these primary elections, you know, both in the Democratic and Republican Party, and it'll sort things out. And guys that aren't doing very well, or gals in this case in 2020 that aren't showing very well, maybe are going to drop out, and you're going to get the convention. You have maybe 1 or 2. Well, McCarthy wants to see if he can compete with Johnson, and by God, after the New Hampshire primary, he almost beats him, which tells him that he's got a shot here. But who's watching every move and every success McCarthy's having? Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy's sitting in the background. He's watching in the wings, and he's seeing how well McCarthy's doing against Johnson in these primaries.
He wants Johnson to win?
No, he's seeing how good can McCarthy beat the sitting president. Now, I didn't tell you this, but since the president's assassination and since he left Johnson's cabinet, he decided to run for senator of New York. And it was a little bit controversial because was he really from New York? No, he's from Massachusetts. So what he did is he moved into New York long enough to get residency, and he ran and defeated a pretty popular incumbent. And he was a little bit criticized for it because he wasn't a New Yorker. But the bottom line was he was elected senator from New York. And at that point, you know, he feels like he's got an eye on the presidency. So he's watching every single move McCarthy's made. Now that tells you something about Robert Kennedy. If you can move into New York, and even though some people were upset that he was kind of not doing this right, did they elect him? Mm-hmm. Sure they did. He was that popular. But he's setting back Senator Robert F. Kennedy of New York, watching McCarthy's success, okay? Well, finally, on March 16th of 1968, and when's the election going to be? What month? November. So it's fairly late.
That's the day before St. Patty's Day.
There you go. Senator Robert Kennedy announces publicly that he will seek the Democratic nomination for president. So he now is going to try to win against Lyndon Johnson and get the Democratic nomination. Kiddos, this is really unusual for people to challenge an incumbent president when they want to be reelected. But the war sums it all up.
So if he wouldn't have been assassinated,
You know, we're gonna get into that, but historians believe there would have been little doubt. But we'll talk about that. So on March 16th, 1968, he announces his candidacy for the Democratic nomination. So let's put things in perspective. Is Johnson under tremendous pressure right now?
Oh,
And I'm gonna give you 3 serious pressures he's facing right now. Thus the subtopic, the fall of LBJ. Okay, so here are the serious pressures he's facing. First of all, we just mentioned it. Both Senator McCarthy and Senator Kennedy are pushing him for the Democratic nomination in '68. So he has that pressure of having challenges within his own party for the nomination. That's serious pressure. What else? What other event we just talked about is putting tremendous pressure on him? What part of it though? The Tet offensive has really got him under a ton of pressure because he told everybody we were winning in essence, and then we weren't. So he's taken tremendous stress and pressure from the Tet offensive that had occurred in January of '68. And here's where it got interesting. It saddens me that Senator Mansfield, he can't live forever, isn't alive to tell the story like he used to tell my kids when he was alive. We're taking DC. What happened is General Westmoreland requested Johnson send an additional 206,000 troops to Vietnam. So here's Johnson under the pressure of trying to please his overall commander, because what his overall commander wants is 206,000 more. That would bring it to like 760,000. Yeah, that's what he's wanting. So Johnson's under pressure. He's got 2 men within his own party trying to, take him out of the nomination process for president, for re-election. He's got people upset in the pressures of the Tet offensive, and now he's trying to figure out whether he's going to give General Westmoreland the 206,000